Hi. Hi, Jen. We're ready.
Hi.
Yep. Hi. Welcome, everyone, to our Nancy Drew and her mysterious history. I have Jen Fisher with me today. I met Jen a couple years ago, and I think Jen is like one of a diehard Nancy Drew fan, and that's probably not the way to explain her, but I can't wait to hear her presentation and have everybody hear what she has to say and her information that she has. So, hi, Jen.
Hi. Thanks for having me. So we if you want we can get started with the PowerPoint and I'll just, cue you when it's time to roll through. So that'd be great. So yeah, as she said, I am here to talk about Nancy and her mysterious history and also a little bit about collecting Nancy Drew. I don't know, for those of you joining us, if you are more of a casual Nancy fan or a little intermediate, or if you're just a diehard Nancy Drew fan like myself. But there's going to be a little bit of something here for everybody. I met Melissa several years ago at one of the conventions, and it was so much fun. We were talking before this about, wanting to get back to normal and kind of when that next convention is. So I'll talk a little bit, you can go to the next one, about kind of how I got into Nancy Drew and what I do as far as Nancy Drew goes. How did I go from Nancy Drew fan to Nancy Drew expert, as people often call me? Next one. Basically, like most of you, I read these books as a kid. Some of you may be here because you were, a gamer and you got into the books that way. But I read the books as a kid and, over time expanded my collection to a really insanely large grouping of everything Nancy Drew, as I like to call it. Now these are some shelves of a lot of my collection before most of it was donated to the Toledo Public Library. I read the books as a kid, and I'll just tell a little story about that. And then, I read, the classics. I read the paperbacks, the spinoffs. I went off to law school after college, and I still have my childhood Nancy Drew books. And, I found a vintage one from the 30s. And at that time, I didn't know they existed back that far because when I was reading them, it was the very end of the 70s, mostly in the 80s and 90s, when I was growing up. So I wasn't familiar with that, and it was very intriguing to me, almost kind of like a Nancy Drew mystery. So late 90s, I was online. I'd gotten a computer on America Online. Got on there and met some other collectors that had been collecting for quite a while, more collecting than I was considered what I did. I was just a fan and I had a lot of books, but I kind of morphed into a collector at this point because I wanted to get all of those books back through to the 30s when the whole series started. I was interested in all the vintage editions and all the collectibles you could find that I had no clue about. And, learning about kind of the history behind Nancy Drew. So that sort of led me online to meet other collectors. I got on eBay and collected lots of things I couldn't find locally. And we formed a discussion group called Nancy Drew Sleuths. And, I had that group. It's sort of grown over time into more of a formal business and organization. We have annual conventions. We do merchandise. We have a series zine magazine that we're now doing special issues of from time to time that focuses on, different aspects of Nancy Drew and other series books. So we have a lot of fun doing all of this. And at the same time, I began researching the history of Nancy Drew, reading books that people had written about it. I was able to consult on projects with publishers. I was able to compile Clues for Real Life about Nancy Drew. It's like a fun little gift book with quotes and quizzes and little fun activities. Next one. And then I began many years ago when I was able to research more about the original Carolyn Keene, who first wrote Nancy Drew, Mildred Ward Benson. So I've been off and on researching and writing about her and working on a biography. Life gets in the way, as it always does. I have a lot of other obligations, but I do a little when I can. And, then I tend to go down the rabbit hole of research. I find something new that nobody's ever heard of before about her, and I get involved in investigating that, and it sends me down a whole nother tangent of research. And it's just insane how much there is about her that people don't even know about. So I'm trying to kind of get the big picture together. So that's what I've been working on. And so that's what I do. And a couple years ago, the Toledo Public Library reached out to me. A few years before that, I had asked one of the women that works there about possibly donating my collection someday, meaning like down the road, to Toledo, because they have a lot of space. It's a phenomenal library, especially the children's department is beautiful. I mean, they have an original Tandy painting of Shadow Ranch. I mean, they have a lot of Mildred Ward Benson's items. They have a whole collection of her books there in their rare book room. So it seemed like an appropriate place, especially since many of the classic Nancy Drew books were written in Toledo by Mildred Ward Benson. So they reached out to me when the whole library was doing a renovation. Some of the images you're seeing right now are my collection there as we were kind of setting some of it up back at the end of 2019. And there's the Shadow Ranch painting. They hung that in the room. So they carved out a little space where they could put a bunch of my collection. And then they'll be doing rotating exhibits once everything's more back to normal at the library after the last year and a half of, pandemic craziness. So anyhow, that was an interesting thing to be able to do, an exciting thing, just to be able to let the public enjoy the collection and not let it sit and collect dust in my house. It kind of had a purpose and a use. So it was a nice opportunity to be able to do this and let people be able to research and learn more about Nancy and her history and collecting. So that's kind of what I do on the Nancy Drew side. Why don't we jump into her mysterious history? This is a history that could fill volumes. There's so much dense information behind Nancy Drew, mysteries that even she never solved. So I'll touch on some highlights. I do list a page here if anybody wants to do a quick screen grab of some resources related to the history behind her. You can also just go to nancydrewsleuth.com and find all sorts of links from there. But Nancy Drew was created by a man named Edward Strathemire. And the first 3 books were published April 28, 1930. It was like a breeder set. And the most infamous of the 3 is of course, the first one, The Secret of the Old Clock, though Hidden Staircase is often a lot of people's favorite because it's so spooky. But Edward Strathemire ran a company called the Strathemire Syndicate, and it was like a book packager. They would create these books. He would write, outlines and create characters and devise the plots. And he would hire ghostwriters who would be paid a flat fee and would sign away their rights to the characters and stories and the pen name for that flat fee. And then he would sort of farm them out to publishers who would publish the books. And he had contracts with various publishers. Nancy Drew's publisher was Grosset and Dunlap, which is now owned by Penguin Random House today, and Simon & Schuster, because of a trial that we'll get to in a minute. So Edward Strathemire, he was very literary. He had written books, story papers, dime novels. He had a very prolific imagination of lots of different ideas and things. He capitalized on the day's headlines for kids. He was very, very good at hitting the spots that kids were interested in and providing really what he considered safe and sane entertainment for kids. They called him the father of the 50 center. Fortune magazine in 1934 compared him to Rockefeller for oil, as he was the Rockefeller of children's literature. He was just an amazing man. And about 1905, he formed this syndicate and hired many different ghostwriters to write different series. He had hired Mildred Ward Benson, who was the first Carolyn Keene, to work on his Ruth Fielding series. And here's some pictures of Millie back in the day. After writing several Ruth Fieldings, he had her in mind to write for Nancy Drew. Well, shortly after Nancy Drew debuted in 1930, you'll see on the screen his daughter Edna, and here's his daughter Harriet. Barely 2 weeks, nearly 2 weeks after after Nancy Drew debuted, he passed away. So these two sisters basically were left to, well, they tried to sell the company, but it was the Depression. So they basically decided to just continue on their father's legacy and run this company, which was pretty amazing. His assistant, Harriet Otis Smith, sort of helped them for several months during the transition of them taking full reins at the syndicate and moving the business to New Jersey from New York. Next slide. So here on the screen, we'll focus on these people for a little bit. These are what I call the Drew team. These are all the people really strongly involved in creating and writing and producing and marketing Nancy Drew into the popular phenomenon that she was. By the mid-30s, she was outselling the Boys series, according to Fortune magazine. So along the top, you have Edward Strathemire top left, Mildred Ward Benson on the right to him. And then next to her, you have Russell Tandy, who illustrated many of the early Nancy Drew books. And then next to him is Strathemire's daughter, Edna. In the middle on the left is his daughter, Harriet. On the far right in the middle is Grace Horton. She was the second, most likely second, model for Nancy Drew, coming in around the late 30s for some of the last handy covers. And then on the bottom left, you have Harriet Otis Smith, his capable and very handy assistant from the syndicate that she basically finished the outline to Shadow Ranch, wrote it, and probably created the characters of Bess and George. So she was a very important figure in the history of Nancy Drew, who you don't hear a lot about. And Edna, his daughter, was most heavily involved with Nancy Drew and with Mildred Wirt for her books that she wrote during the 30s until Edna basically sort of retired and became more of a silent business partner, though not very silent. The sisters had quite an interesting relationship, but she moved to Florida. And then Harriet sort of ran the business for many years, so she took on some partners later on. So on the bottom next to Harriet Otis Smith, we have a naval man, Walter Carrick, who stepped in and wrote 3 Nancy Drew books in the 30s when Mildred did not want to take a pay cut during the Depression. And he wrote books 8, 9, and 10. And then Millie came back to write thereafter. So Millie wrote 23 of the first 30. She wrote books 1 through 7, and then 11 through 25, and then number 30. And then next to Carrick on the very bottom right too we have Grosset and Dunlap, the publishers, who kind of had a hand in choosing Nancy's name. You know, Strathemire would propose names and titles and, series topics to them. And they sort of, there was a whole list of different names. Nancy could have been Stella Strong. That was one of the suggestions. But they had Nan Drew on the list, and it was sort of lengthened to Nancy Drew. So it's just interesting, all these different people that are involved in the process and who helped sort of create and sort of lay the foundation for all these years later that we're still talking about Nancy Drew, and she's still being published. Next slide. So we'll segue now into collecting Nancy Drew, but just want to add a couple things because we're going to get into this when I talk about collecting Nancy Drew. Number one, in 1980, after running the syndicate for many, many years, there was a trial. And in 1979, Grosset and Dunlap published the last hardcover at the time, Nancy Drew, which was book number 56, The 13th Pearl. And then, lo and behold, publisher Simon Schuster published book number 57 in paperback, The Triple Hoax. And this did not sit well with Grosset and Dunlap. Harriet had decided to change publishers after all those years. She was not happy with royalties and other issues. And Simon & Schuster courted her quite a bit. And so she changed publishers. Grosset was not happy. They sued Gulf and Western, which was the parent company for Simon & Schuster and the Strathemire Syndicate. And they ended up in court in 1980 for this huge trial, trying to deal with the copyright issues. I don't want to get into all the legalese of it, but the gist of the trial was that Grosset in the end would get the right to keep reprinting and publishing the first 56. And Simon & Schuster would have the rights to basically do all the news stories from then onward, so 57 onward, not to mention all the spinoffs that would come over the years and everything else that they do. So that's sort of a big thing in publishing history. And then in 1984, the syndicate was sold to Simon & Schuster after Harriet Adams had passed in 1982. The remaining partners and the family decided to sell. So there's just some big things that happened. One other thing that happened over the years that was pretty big was beginning in 1959, The Secret of the Old Clock hit the shelves in a very different format. It was now 20 chapters and revised. And there were different subplots, mostly the same story, but there were changes. So between 1959 and 1977, the first 34 books were revised over time and shortened to 20 chapters, mainly because the publisher, it was cheaper to publish a 20 chapter text than a 25, because books 25 and on had begun being written and published in a 20 chapter format. Also, there was a printing plate issue. As old printing plates would be worn out and have to be replaced, they would, revise that book. So the revising didn't go in complete order. It was different orders that they did these in over time. So you might be surprised, or you might not, if you pick up a book that you might have read as a child that had 25 chapters and might have been a little bit different of a story, to pick up that book today, because what's still in print by Penguin Random House are the revised versions of 1 through 34. And then, of course, books 35 to 56. Some of the books became all new stories when they were revised. For example, the Moss-Covered Mansion book in the original was set around a moss-covered mansion, but it's very different than the revised version, which had a moss-covered mansion, but also a whole NASA kind of evil mad scientist plot and exploding oranges, this plot to destroy a rocket with NASA. And so anyhow, it was a completely different story when they revised it. So some people are kind of surprised. There weren't that many that changed so drastically. But those are just a few things I want to mention briefly before we get into collecting Nancy Drew. Next, please. Here's a few resources if you want to look more into collecting. Now, some of you may still have your childhood books, and that's okay for you. That's all you're going to focus on. Some of you want to get everything Nancy Drew. There's a whole spectrum of collecting. So there's a little bit of something for all of you at my website. And certainly some of it is geared towards a more diehard collector when you get into the format section. But these resources will help you out. Next. And you may not know it, but there have been over 600 cases solved by this year. You may wonder how there could possibly be that many Nancy Drew books. Well, if you add them all up, it comes to over 600. I think this year we reached 675. And that includes the classics, the revised, all of the different spin-offs, the paperbacks that continued the classics, special edition books, on and on. Yeah, so there's a lot of books you can collect. There's also a lot of cover art and a lot of different looks for Nancy over the years, as some of you might be interested. For example, we have, and you can just kind of scroll through these, Melissa, we have 1930s Nancy Drew here. We have Nancy Drew from the 40s on some of these beautiful covers that Tandy did. And then we segue kind of from 40s to 50s here with her June Cleaver dress. And then we get into the 60s. She's got reddish hair by now, or Titian as it was referred to in the books. And then we keep going and we transition into the 70s. Definitely more of a 70s look for Nancy Drew. And then we get into those paperbacks I mentioned that Simon & Schuster started publishing. And so from 1979 to 2003, we continued that whole classic series of paperbacks through 175. And then there were spinoffs and new series that replaced it, like Girl Detective. There was a series for younger kids, the Nancy Drew Notebooks, which became the Nancy Drew and the Clue Crew, which now is Nancy Drew Clue Book. There were Files spinoffs. There's been different cover art special editions. There's now the Nancy Drew Diary series, which is the current 8 to 12 set book series that Simon & Schuster publishes. So there's so many different varieties of Nancy Drew that you can collect. There's a little bit of Nancy Drew for everybody. And if you're really a fan of modern, there's graphic novels and there's comic books. So again, something for everybody. Now, just you can kind of just wait a little bit between each one, but I just want to show you just what you can see at my website. If you go to the Nancy Drew collecting section, you can see it's broken down into different sections based on dust jackets, the boards that came, the books that came under the dust jackets, the picture covers after dust jackets were no longer used, end papers used in the books, cover art, information about internal illustrations, the people who wrote the books, and then collecting tips and selling tips if you're interested in selling books. Next. And then you can kind of just see just here, like I can break down the formats, and it's done on my website too by decade even, but you can kind of see along the top how we progress from the white spine dust jacket with no silhouette to a white spine with a silhouette to a wrap spine dust jacket, and then finally a picture cover. The blue books in the next row all were different styles of the books that came under the dust jackets, and then the last two rows are the different end papers. Some collectors like to collect certain formats within all of this. Some like the one blue book in the middle of the blue books row where she's got the 1930s silhouette, but it's in blue instead of orange. I always love to find those. So there's all sorts of fun things you can collect. Next. You'll also see things broken down on my website where you can learn what style of book came under dust jackets and which books came out like this. If you're wanting, for example, if you want to get a uniform set of books, only the blue tweed books were only basically the first 38 books came out with dust jackets. So if you want to get a set of all 38 in a dust jacket and have something matching, the boards themselves, you can get the tweeds because the tweeds covered through all those. So you can get a full set of tweeds if you want something matchy. So you can learn about how you can do that on my website. Next. I also have sections like on the picture cover and what different end papers came with these books. So you can learn more about the picture covers and some of the different formats within that. Next. And then I also include what you can find in bookstores today, those glossy hardcover flashlight books that we call them with the flashlight symbol across the top. Next. And then right here, the next couple of slides, just an example of charts and things you can find in the format section on my website, which will also help you figure out what books came out with what formats if you're wanting to kind of have a checklist. Next. And just briefly, you can learn more about the dust jackets, how they changed over time, and what books came out with those styles. The board section goes through the same thing. You can learn about the different styles there. And there's an end paper section. You can learn about all the different end papers, even the last set, which is probably people's least favorite, the double ovals. And there's a section on the picture covers, which you can also delve into those a little bit more. And so those are just some highlights from the format section of my website. And then if you also go in there and you go in the books section of the website to the classic books section, you will find as you go down the screen, there's each book in a row, and I show all the cover art for that book along with a synopsis. You can see how the cover art progressed over time, and you can see how many different cover art were issued for a particular book. Most of them had 3. A couple just had 2, and one book on the bottom there, the Broken Locket book, had 4 different cover art. So a lot of collectors like to collect for the art as well. So you can see all the different covers that are out there you can collect. Next. And if you're really industrious and want to move beyond the basic books, you can collect different types of editions of these classic books. So there's library editions on the left. In the middle, there's an example of a book club edition. We had 4 different book club editions that came out, and you can find those in the Nancy Drew books section of my website. And on the right bottom, there is an example of a foreign edition. Many different countries Nancy Drew was published in. And if you go to nancydrewworld.com, you can learn a lot about foreign editions. That's not my website, but there's another collector who has a very prolific foreign editions website. And you can see lots of covers and for the different countries there. Next. There's also some reprints you can collect of the classics. Applewood Books did the first 21 books and reprinted them just as you remember them was their slogan. So you can find Applewood editions. And then we move into collectibles. Collectibles are typically based on the books, movies, and television in general. And then there's kind of a category of modern collectibles and things in the last decade or more that have been put out by lots of companies licensing Nancy Drew. These are examples from the 30s movie starring Benita Granville. Next. And then we have on the left some examples of just pictures and stills from the 70s TV show starring Pamela Sue Martin, along with the Hardy Boys featured there and the movie from '07. And then we get into some book-related collectibles and just some examples of those. There's a mystery game. There's a costume also related to the television show shown there. Next. And then there was some dolls in the 60s, Madame Alexander dolls with different outfits. And then there was a red diary. There's also a white version. There's a Nancy Drew cookbook. There was also lots of Nancy Drew games in recent years from Her Interactive. If you're into games, you can collect something more modern like that. Next. There were fun little collectibles like these, the Cookie Crisp cereal box, and also all the little cartoon booklets you could get inside. I finally managed to collect all of those, and they are all in Toledo at the library if you ever want to go see them. But those were fun to find. A lunchbox from the television series. And so that's just a sort of an overview of all the collectibles. What I have done is if you go to Pinterest, pinterest.com/Nancy Drew Expert, I have many, many dozens of boards there on my Pinterest page, which break down collectibles by type, like the 70s TV show, the 30s movies, advertising boards, art boards. I mean, it goes on and on, book club boards. So if you want to see all of the hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of collectibles out there and ephemera that I've found, you can browse through Pinterest and see what is out there to collect. A little bit of it's featured at my website, but Pinterest has just about everything. It's kind of my catalog for my collectibles. So I've kind of gone over Nancy Drew's mysterious history and given you an overview. If you go to the history section of my website, I have a nice little timeline that will take you back through time and go through some highlights of Nancy Drew over the years. And you go to the collecting and the format section of my website and the books section. You can learn about all the books. There is a collectibles section that breaks down the different types of collectibles. And then there's my Pinterest page. And that'll kind of get you started. Maybe it'll inspire you to be like me, an anything Nancy Drew collector. Or maybe you'll have some interest in a particular decade, or maybe it's movie collectibles or television collectibles that spark your interest. But there's something Nancy for everybody, which is always nice. And I still recommend sites like eBay, and also Etsy is a good one for finding, those hard to find things that you can't find locally. But it's always fun to hit your local bookstores and library sales and book sales and antique stores, to see what's out there. So I always recommend kind of, as we say, going into the wild and searching there, because that's always fun. So I just thought I would wrap up my chat here with you guys and with a little Nancy nostalgia, sort of those scenes and fun things we remember from the books over the years, that kind of, what reasons why we loved the book so much and Nancy. And I'll mix it with some quotes from my Clues for Real Life book based on Nancy's adventures in the books. Next. The sleuthing business is always important, especially when you learn how to eavesdrop, as Nancy often did. Next. When you're unusually good at what you do, the police will yearn for your women's intuition. That was from the Clue of the Leaning Chimney. They were always interested in Nancy's intuition because she had very, very good intuition. Next. Nancy had to deal with snooty villains. She was often locked in closets and left to starve. I just love these vintage Tandy images. There were always ruses to get into places and find clues, and there were always threats to drop the case or else. After being kidnapped, it's only proper to take a bath and change your clothes before reporting the crime to the police from The Ghost of Blackwood Hall. Nancy never failed to be unfailingly polite and, of course, proper with her etiquette, especially in those vintage editions. That's kind of funny. Next. Nancy was often getting bound and gagged or conked over the head, and, of course, always made puzzling discoveries in interesting, spooky places. Next. And, of course, we can't forget Nancy's swell chums. At first, there was Helen Corning, then there was Bess and George. Next. You can always talk a loyal friend into joining you in your schemes and ruses. From the password to Lark's Plane. Yeah, no matter what the mystery, she always managed to rope Bess and George, or at least one of them, into joining her. Next. There were always favorite cliffhanger moments, when you didn't know what was going to happen to Nancy, but you hoped she'd survive to the next chapter. And hidden staircases. There were certainly lots of those, as well as secret passageways. Next. There was always moments where she evaded villains. And of course, there were always phone threats. And sometimes masked intruders showed up at the Drew home, scaring the wits out of poor Hannah. Next. I want to talk a little bit about dastardly villains, because she's certainly tangled with a lot of them. Next. When people irritate you, it's best to stifle a snarky retort and not let them get the best of you. From The Secret of the Old Clock. Nancy, again, unfailingly polite, even when she wanted to, be a little snarky. She'd try to be polite instead. So we sort of learned that lesson from Nancy, even though it's hard in real life to do that. Next. There were also travelogues. Some of my favorite Nancy Drew books are the travelogues, where she goes somewhere that's a real life place and you kind of learn about the culture or, different historical or other topics in the book that become sort of, Harriet liked to especially sprinkle her books with little tidbits and facts that you would learn as a kid. Next. You know you're clues obsessed when you can't imagine a vacation to solve without a mystery to solve. The Mystery of the Brass-Bound Trunk. Yeah, there was rarely ever a vacation that Nancy didn't go on that she didn't find some sort of mystery to get involved with. Next. Nancy tailed suspects. She came to people's rescue. She was our hero growing up and today. Red lipstick makes a great window SOS when you've been kidnapped and stolen away on a plane. Mystery of the Fire Dragon. Next. That was just one of the most iconic to me. One of the most iconic images from Nancy Drew. And here you see it. Nancy on a plane, kidnapped, bound, and writing an SOS with her lipstick on the window. And it's so funny because, what plane is going to, if this happened to us, what plane is going to be coming near our plane to see that SOS? But of course, Nancy was lucky that there was a plane nearby that saw the SOS and helped rescue her. She also tangled with all kinds of wildlife in these books. Often George was the one that something happened to her. Next. There were stakeouts and spooky attics. Next. And that's our wrap up of Nancy Drew Nostalgia. And here's just sort of a resource wrap up here at the end of where you can find the collectibles, collecting in history. If you want to learn more about Nancy Drew sleuths with our website, nancydrewfans.com, and our conventions and what we do and our series zine, The Sleuths, you can go to Nancy Drew Fans. And I did some blogs at my nancydrewsleuths.blogspot.com blog. I did 31 posts several years ago where I delved into every little aspect of Nancy Drew more in depth. And there's lots of pictures and things in there. If you want to read through those, you can learn a little more about everything I've talked about a little more in depth. So that is my presentation on Nancy Drew and her history and collecting. So I hope some of you learned a lot and maybe were inspired to collect more, expand your collections, maybe become a crazy all everything Nancy Drew collector and join the crowd. Maybe come join us at one of our conventions and meet other fans. If you're on Facebook, just search Nancy Drew book fans. You'll find our main group on Facebook where we chat about all things Nancy Drew. We also have a Nancy Drew TV fans and Nancy Drew game fans. We have a Nancy Drew book club where we're discussing all the books. So we have lots of little different groups on Facebook. You can find us, but Nancy Drew book fans is the main one. So.
That was fun, Jen. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
I did have a couple of questions come through.
Okay.
Carol was asking, are there any known counterfeits?
Oh, like counterfeit books?
Yeah.
There are some Taiwanese bootleg books that sometimes you will find on eBay, and they weren't like authorized editions. They just printed them in Thailand, and they look like yellow spine picture covers, but they're thinner. And then on the inside, there's like a page with like a lot of the kanji, the Chinese characters and different things. You can kind of distinguish it. So sometimes if you're looking on eBay and, when the sellers, like you're going through the list of results and you see these really narrow looking yellow spines, sometimes those are bootlegs. Every once in a while, you'll stumble on somebody that's selling some of them or they're mixed in with regular editions.
Cool. So one thing that I was impressed by what you do are the conventions that you mentioned, and that's how I met you.
Yeah.
So can you give a description maybe of one of your conventions and how you go into planning it and what you do?
Okay. So, our conventions morphed over the years from more like just a small gathering of a few of us at the beginning to the sort of more like a mantra, which was following in Nancy's footsteps. So that's kind of our big thing. So what we like to do, and most of them we have done this, we pick a place where a real life location is that's in the books. Like, for example, New Orleans. So our first New Orleans convention, we chose the haunted Showboat, and we went there, and they have a showboat called the Natchez. So we had a mystery dinner on the Natchez, which was really fun. We also had a second New Orleans convention there, and we also focused on Showboat, but some other ones. But we did a swamp tour. They were out, in the swamp in the book. So we try to sort of follow in her footsteps that she does things in the books. We try to do those things. We don't run down dark alleys chasing suspects or crazy things like that, although that might be fun. But we try to do the fun things. So if she goes to a place that's real or in general a swamp, we will replicate that and go and have a swamp tour, or we'll go to a site that she goes to in the books. And we try to do mysteries and theme parties based on that book, and have little mysteries or activities that people can solve or work on that are based on the theme books. So we just kind of try to bring the book alive for everybody. And it's a lot of fun. So we typically have like a meet and greet party, where everybody meets, they get a goodie bag. And that kind of kicks off the time that we have wherever we're located. Sometimes they're just a couple days. Sometimes we've had longer conventions. The recent years have been more like a Wednesday through a Saturday generally. And so we'll have some touring that we do. Sometimes we'll have group dinners. We'll have some parties. We always end up with like a finale event on the Saturday, the last event of the convention, which is a mystery dinner. And so there'll be some sort of mystery or activity to solve. And we'll have dinner, and there's usually a gift exchange for those who want to participate. We can either buy or craft something fun that's Nancy Drew. It has to be Nancy Drew related, but people love to participate in the gift exchange. That's always fun. So we just do little fun things like that. Every once in a while, we'll do a book discussion if we can fit it in. We've done that a few times. One other thing we always want to do, and we've done this the last few years, we donate a full set of Nancy Drew books to the local library where we're going to use in circulation for the kids. Sometimes libraries have some and they don't need the full set, so we'll fill in what they don't have. But generally, we do a full set. And we've been doing these library presentations where we have like an event at the library. We present them with the books, and then we kind of, give a little talk for the public about Nancy Drew and collecting or other interesting topics related to Nancy Drew. So we sort of have a convention style event like that. We've had convention days at the hotel where we have speakers. We've moved more towards the library event format. We usually have like a Nancy Drew merchandise and book sale event where people bring vintage books to sell and merchandise to sell that's licensed either through our boutique or they're selling vintage items. So yeah, so we do have something for like everybody. It's lots of fun. It's kind of like a big family reunion when we get together because we have so much in common through Nancy Drew that it's just an automatic, you feel like you know people well because you have those interests. So it's always a lot of fun to see everybody and meet new people.
Now, all the ladies that are watching, you can't be jealous, but I was at the convention where it was Parker Stevenson was there.
Yeah.
So that was kind of cool.
Yeah, Pamela and Parker, they're so nice. We had so much fun hosting them. They had come to our San Diego convention several years before that. And then we got them to come to Maine. I think that was the year that it was like the 40th anniversary, of the TV shows beginning. So that was really fun.
Yep. That was a good convention. It was fun. Very creative. So I went with my sisters and we had a good time.
You guys look like you were having a lot of fun.
Yeah, we did.
Oh, that's neat.
So I had another question come through that is kind of a good question. And she said, my books were blue, not yellow.
Okay.
Is that a possibility?
Oh, yeah. So in the beginning, they were blue. In fact, they started out in 1930. They were blue with no silhouette on the cover of the book. And they had a white spine dust jacket. And by 1932, they added that familiar orange silhouette. And it was around for a little bit. And then at one point it became blue briefly. And then it was revised in the 40s to remove the shadow and the heels and the scarf she was wearing to more of a 40s silhouette. And then we ended up with the last blue version, which was that silhouette, but a tweed kind of pattern to the books. It looked like a blue tweed pattern to the texture of the boards. So that was sort of the evolution of those. And then right after the tweeds, we had in the early 60s, we had the yellow spine picture covers come out. So, so the books in the blue with the dust jackets were from 1930 to like around 1961.
Cool. Thank you for answering that.
Sure.
So I don't see any other questions. I'm kind of waiting a couple minutes.
Okay.
Someone did say it must be fun to try to hunt down a book for your collection.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because, I just sort of started out wanting to get those 30s editions I didn't know anything about. And then I was hearing from other collectors about how the books were revised. So I had to get all the original text versions. So then I could read the original with the revised, which I had mostly pretty much just grew up with revised versions. I could compare them because I was really curious. And then it became, I've got to get that edition. I've got to get this edition. I've got to get everything. And so it just became, and it was something that I collected for close to 25 years. I mean, if I'm doing the math right, I started around 97, and I donated the collection in 2019. So yeah, not quite 25 years, a little over 20, that I just collected all of these things. So it wasn't, if I tried to do it all at once today, there's so much you just can't find that easily. Some of the ephemera or the unusual advertising materials. And then, of course, there's like one-off items that there's only one, like the original cover art. I have several paintings. I don't have anywhere near as amazing a cover art. I mean, not even, I can't even talk. But Jim McNamara has an amazing series book cover art collection. He has so many beautiful paintings. And Mike Gowitz has, an amazing collection. He has 2 Tandys. There's so many collectors that have just so many amazing things. I tried to focus on just getting a little bit of everything at first. And then I was like, no, I want it all. So then I just tried to get, I wanted one of every book, one of every text, one of every cover art. Then I wanted first printings of every book. So I focused on first printings, and I was always upgrading. Like if I'd go to a bookstore, an antique store, or even see something really nice on eBay, I would upgrade what I had if it wasn't minty, or as I like to call it, Jim McNamara minty. He's got a beautiful minty collection. Um, I would try to upgrade over time. So I've upgraded some of my books, and then as modern stuff started becoming more popular, like in the last 2 decades, a lot of companies licensing Nancy Drew, and there's been, some like the comic books, there's been puzzles and some games and just different things. Like I buy the modern stuff. There was a company called the Gumshoe Girls that did a lot of pajamas and handbags and some t-shirts and things in the early 2000s. So I was getting a lot of their things. They had jewelry. So I also collected a lot of like modern collectibles in addition to vintage. I liked, one last thing I'll add to that is I like to tell a story with my collecting, and it kind of morphed into that. It didn't start out that way, but as I would find things over time, mostly through eBay, like if I had a book club edition, like the twin thriller book club editions, for instance, I would find advertising material for that book club, like the TV guide that had the ad that you could tear out and mail in to join the club, or the actual club envelope that was mailed to people to interest people in joining the club, or little bits and pieces like that would be behind the scenes and how the product was created, and then the actual product that I would collect. So I like to kind of tell a story with my collecting. So I would try to get all the different pieces of that puzzle. And that's a lot of that has gone to Toledo. So they can sort of do exhibits where they're piecing together kind of the behind the scenes and then the actual club items. There's letters, there's different things like that. I even own some vintage fan letters that people wrote to or received from the syndicate. Generally Harriet Adams, as Carolyn Keene or one of the others, would send to fans when they would write in. I have a few fan letters or replies in my collection and little fun things like that. So I was always looking for any interesting piece of the puzzle that is Nancy Drew, to collect. So it's just very eclectic and a lot. So hopefully, eventually they're planning to digitize the collection in Toledo. So those that can't travel to Toledo very easily can at least look at a lot of it online. You can see a lot of it at my Pinterest page because a lot of that went there. But I'm still collecting for the collection, even though it's in Toledo. I don't have everything. I have a lot. There's definitely things that I never could find, that I'm still looking for. So I'm always scouring eBay and other sites, looking for elusive items. I've added a few things, since I donated, like the TV show in 1995, there was a backpack. I finally found one of those and I was able to get the backpack. The watch from the 70s show, the Pamela Sue Martin watch. I never had the original band to the watch. So the band that's in Toledo is just something somebody replaced the original with. I finally was able to collect the watch with the original band. So eventually that'll go to Toledo. So there's little things like that. I held back some items I didn't donate, like my original cover art. I still have that, and a lot of signed books. So I have signed books from like Harriet, signed books. Not that she did it for me. I've just collected them with her signature. And then I have some that Mildred Benson actually signed to me when I met her the year before she died in Toledo at our first unofficial convention. I have signed books from some of the illustrators like Rudy Nappy and Bill Gillies. So those were really special to me. So I held on to those for now. There's been some gifts and things people have given me that I held on to. I donated some of my gift exchange gifts I've gotten over the years at conventions that people have made just so they'd have a neat kind of handcrafted Nancy Drew fan section in there. But there's some that some fans and friends have made for me that were really special. So I held on to those for now. So there's lots of things that'll go still yet to Toledo, but they got the majority of everything at the beginning. So anyhow, that's kind of an overview of why and what I did, the who done it.
Are you in touch with other collectors then?
Yeah. So, and I even, there's another collector that's going to be donating a painting to the library. And there's other collectors that know that, if someday they have something that I don't have in the collection, they want to donate it to Toledo, the library would love to have it. If there's anything that they don't have, just to make it more complete. I stay in touch with lots of collectors through my website, our Facebook pages. So yeah, but I'm still collecting for the collection. I'm still collecting for myself. My goal is to just sort of now have one of every text written. So those 675 and on books. So I can always read the story, or if I need it for research, I'll have a copy here. And then to collect for the classic books and the earlier paperbacks, like each cover art. So I'll have all the art on hand if I need it for something or just want to look at it. So that's sort of my goal now. Even though I have the other collection that I donated and I'm still collecting for, I have my own little small collection I'm going to keep with me too that I'm working on. And I still have my childhood books. I didn't donate those for now. I wanted to keep those. And I didn't have a lot of childhood books, but I had a small selection that I had. I read a lot at the school library growing up. So I had a hodgepodge of a collection when I became sort of a collector, wanting to collect lots of things. So by the 90s, I had some of the books still as a kid, but not all. So those ones that I did have as a kid, I've held on to for a while.
So I have another guest, Brenna, that mentioned that she checked out her very first Nancy Drew game from the library in the early 2000s.
Well, probably one of the computer games, right?
Yep.
Yeah, those are fun.
They
And
are.
it's such an interesting community of fans. Somewhat different in some ways from the book collector community, but a lot of the game fans, like they discovered Nancy through the games, not the books, which is so interesting because I went into it opposite. I was books, then games. So I try to picture what it's like if you just discovered her through the games first. It's so different. But yeah, they're very diehard fans. They're very loyal fans. They love those games.
Yep.
And they're anticipating and hoping for the next one. And I don't know much about what's happening with the next one, but I know that the wait for Midnight in Salem was quite a while and quite a frustrating wait for some of them. But that was also going to be a theme for our upcoming Salem convention, was the computer game Midnight in Salem.
I think so. I lost our presenter. So I'm going to wrap up and just thank everybody for. Oh, she came back.
I'm
I
back.
lost you for a minute.
I know. Here I am. Sorry
That
about
was a
that.
mystery.
It was. It
mystery.
was just
Yeah.
everything just went blank.
Yeah.
So
I was going to get my lipstick and write SOS, but.
Yep.
But thank you so much, Jen, for sharing all of this. I read them as a child, but now I think I have a whole different perspective. So
well, good. I hope I've inspired you to be an anything Nancy Drew collector.
Yeah.
Or maybe not quite that insane of a jump leap or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, just if I've inspired anybody to just seek out something else or learn a little more about Nancy Drew, that's my goal. Because being around for over 90 years is pretty amazing. She's inspired a lot of people, and our Supreme Court Justice ladies, most of them tend to cite her as an influence. So I think that's pretty amazing. And, if anybody wants to continue the chat, you can always email me at my website. You can go to our Nancy Drew Book Fans Facebook group and ask questions and join up with other collectors. So, yep.
Thank you for doing this for us, Jen. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yep. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Have a good night.
Good night, everybody.